Thank you for joining us for today's ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Program, How Things Work, the Legal Edition. The episode today is focused on cultural erasure. My name is Linda Benally, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this conversation. I serve on the ABA's United Nations Committee as an observer to the UN Economic and Social Council in Geneva. I also serve as a member of the Native American Concerns Committee of the Civil Rights and Social Justice section. This conversation is part of the Rapid Response Project that addresses how our civil rights are being impacted by actions being taken by the new administration. These videos are a unique opportunity to address what is happening in America today, clarify any misinformation or disinformation being spread, as well as how civil rights and social justice advocates can act to protect the rights of everyone. Today's topic on cultural erasure is more critical than ever. As we confront attempts to remove Indigenous history from the national landscape, it's essential to examine how these issues intersect with the principles of justice and equity that guide the work of our section and the ABA generally. We are honored today to have with us Anne-Marie Bledsoe-Downes, who is the Executive Vice President of Community Impact and Engagement at Ho-Chunk Inc., and Professor of Practice at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. She previously served as Principal Deputy Solicitor and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Ms. Bledsoe-Downes was the Executive Director of the Indian Legal Program at ASU, and prior to that role, served as the Director of Graduate Programs for the ILP. She also served as the Policy Advisor for Tribal Affairs for Arizona Governor Napolitano, and also was a former president of Little Priest Tribal College. Ms. Bledsoe-Downes received her BA from Wayne State College and a JD from Arizona State University Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. Anne-Marie is a member of the State Bar of California. She's an enrolled member of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. Without further ado, let's dive into the topic. Anne-Marie, would you describe what or define what cultural erasure is to begin our conversation?
Happy to, Linda. Let me first thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you and the ABA for inviting me here to participate today, and to our viewers for tuning in. So there is no legal definition for cultural erasure, but essentially what the concern is that there's this renewed attempt to systemically remove or suppress the practices and history of a group of people who have a shared identity or culture. Cultural erasure happens when cultural practices and customs are forgotten or abandoned by a community, and they adopt customs from a more dominant culture. And that can happen through affirmative efforts to make sure that happens.
Thank you for that. So with that framework, can you explain the policy, mandate, law, executive order, or other actions the administration has implemented or enacted?
Happy to do so, Linda. Yeah, there's been a series of actions, and they started early in this presidency. In his first couple days in office, President Trump issued a series of executive orders that set the stage for this attempt. Generally, these executive orders were meant to eliminate and suppress programs or activities that recognized a group based on shared identity or practices: women, transgender individuals, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and others. Generally speaking, these were anti-DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and they were also attacked in the first Trump term. But it was in the second term, on his first full day in office, that President Trump issued the first executive order, or EO 14173, titled Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. And among other things, this executive order rescinds affirmative action and non-discrimination requirements and requires federal contractors and grantees to certify that they don't operate any illegal DEI programs. And then it also requires the U.S. Attorney General to create a strategic enforcement plan to make sure that is indeed not happening. In addition, there was another executive order, 14168, which was titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. It was signed and it defined sex as a biological classification as either male or female, and called for various actions to remove gender identity protections across the government and, to the extent it could, in the private sector. Finally, President Trump issued Executive Order 14151, which was titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. And ultimately, it sought to end all DEI programs and offices across all of federal government. And it was here, under these umbrella of these actions, and others, that the federal agencies and even the private sector began to remove programs and eliminate activities that created awareness of and an opportunity for these groups. For tribal nations, which is what I really want to focus on today, these policies create significant concerns as the federal government has a unique legal and political relationship with tribes. This unique relationship creates affirmative obligations on the behalf of the federal government to tribal nations, and these obligations create a trust relationship between the federal government and tribes. And it's a doctrine rooted in treaties between the United States government and tribes, as well as in federal statutes.
Thank you for that explanation of the current policies and mandates and executive orders that you described. Moving from there, how will the administration's actions impact everyday life, particularly given the political relationship that you just described? And then how will it affect our civil rights and liberties?
Yeah, keeping my focus here on the relationship with tribes, again, Linda, the trust and treaty responsibilities are executed through a government to government or sovereign to sovereign relationship, one that cannot be or eliminated with a policy statement arising out of an executive order or series of executive orders, as we've outlined. Nevertheless, the failure by many, if not most, federal officials to understand that tribal programs are not, in fact, DEI initiatives, and then them using these executive orders as a reason for reducing budgets or obligations, eliminating programs, they instill a fear or an unwillingness to educate officials responsible for implementing this government to government, sovereign to sovereign relationship. And to do so is both a legal failure and a moral failure. For Indigenous peoples and tribal nations, one of the first visual indicators of what these policies look like in implementation was the removal of tribal flags from tribal nations from the Veterans Affairs facilities. And not only was this seen as a failure to recognize the sacrifices of tribal citizens to our country, and in fact, Native Americans have served in the military at the highest per capita rate of any ethnic group, but just as importantly, it showed a willingness to minimize the importance of that very government to government relationship. Other immediate indicators that these executive orders would be used as tools within federal agencies to accelerate efforts to suppress or erase culture and Native American programs was the decision by the Department of Defense and others to completely eliminate celebrations of certain demographic groups, elimination of Black History Month, for example, and Native American Heritage Month, Women's History Month, and others. These efforts alone are harmful, but they can culminate in much more destructive efforts that target more directly the erasure of a group's practices, history, and language. And for tribal nations, these efforts are something we've actually seen before. For viewers who may not know, the United States has implemented various formal policies since the time of first contact with natives, including the policy of assimilation, which was in the late 1800s to early 1900s, and a short time later, the policy of termination, which was from about 1945 to the late 60s. These policies are well documented both in formal statements by federal officials as well as in federal legislative efforts. Tribal language and culture were outlawed during the assimilation era through tools like the Courts of Indian Offenses. Indian children were removed from their homes unilaterally and put into boarding schools where they were not allowed to practice their religion or speak their language. And in the termination era, the federal government actually severed that political relationship and no longer recognized from the federal position the government-to-government relationship with a number of tribes. In short, the impact of these actions can be harmful in numerous ways. They reduce visibility of groups of people, keeping them marginalized and voices suppressed. And at worst, they become tools of purposeful erasure of language, culture, and history, creating a loss of intergenerational knowledge, disenfranchisement, and multiple social harms.
So, Anne-Marie, given the impacts and really, I guess, the actions and the impact of those actions have, let's move to the final question around what lawyers and advocates can do to engage and address the flip side, I guess, of cultural erasure, which is cultural permanence. How can we advance that?
Yeah, Linda, I think that's a really important question and something we want to make sure our viewers are armed with. And as I've mentioned, these attacks, unfortunately, are not new. And for tribal nations, the assimilation and termination era policies that I outlined, they ended. And they ended because they failed. Despite separating children from their families, outlawing religion and culture, forced removal from homelands, tribes stayed focused on preserving language and culture. They educated their own. They advocated for their rights that they had under these treaties, and they simply never gave up. To be clear, despite these multiple attempts over hundreds of years to assimilate Native people and erase culture, tribes remain vibrant and thriving tribal communities, rich in their language, rich in tradition, and rich in culture. As a result, both federal policy and legislation acknowledge that the United States government had failed and that tribes were rich and vibrant nations that contributed to the fabric of American society. And that the United States government had to adhere to those trust and treaty responsibilities. But they also had a responsibility to restore language, culture, because of those previous attempts to erase it. And that the federal government needed to repair the harm done during assimilation and termination eras. And so there's a whole slew of federal legislation that gets to the heart of this, things like the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Tribally Controlled Community Colleges Act, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, and most recently, one of the biggest pieces of federal legislation that really empowered tribes to determine for themselves what should be happening in tribal communities, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. These acts and others create rights of action that tribal legal advocates and tribal citizens can use to combat some of these assaults on DEI initiatives. Tribes are actually positioned better than ever to be able to invest in efforts to document and preserve evidence, which is a key component to responding to these, collecting oral histories, archival records, to show the patterns and harms that are happening as a result of some of these renewed attempts. There are human rights laws that are other sources of advocacy. And at its basic level, we have seen a number of successful attacks, not only from tribes and others, on these executive orders. And tribes and others in these communities need to be looking at possible opportunities to sue over these executive orders. Those are models for all groups to use, not just tribal citizens. For our everyday citizens, it's really important that they continue to center and amplify marginalized voices, supporting language and cultural revitalization to withstand some of these attacks, and challenge the narratives that try to erase culture in their daily conversations, classrooms, and local politics, whether it's changing a curriculum in a local school that no longer represents a more balanced version of history, or just, raising that issue in conversation between friends or family. Those are really daily important things that can be done. And then the more affirmative measures, like making sure we're supporting preservation of cultural sites at our parks, and public history projects that tell these stories that may be trying to be attempted to no longer be present or wiped out, and making sure we're correcting those omissions. Those are some things that both lawyers and our regular everyday citizens can do to combat some of these attempts.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for defining what cultural erasure means, walking us through the framework of the history that underpins cultural erasure, and then shedding light on what's happening today and how it's impacting tribes in the United States, and then as well as, the tribal citizens, and then the U.S. citizenry as a whole. So thank you for framing that for us, and the take that you just walked us through. I think they are very good actionable items that we can take to engage. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. Thank you for being a part of this important dialogue. The issues we explored are complex and challenging, but by coming together in spaces like this, we can take meaningful steps together toward progress. And please remember that the work doesn't stop here. This is a very short information piece to spark a conversation, and it continues with the actions we take in our communities, our workplaces, and within the ABA. I encourage you to stay engaged with the ABA's Civil Rights and Social Justice section. Visit our website and explore upcoming events, and consider how you can shape the work that we're doing. Once again, thank you for watching.